and we'll certainly work from there. But excellent. Well, let's get going. We've got a lot of attendees today, and I'm always happy to hear that. Certainly is an exciting time to with the holiday week next week. So thank you again for joining all us today. This is going to be a presentation on assessments and budgeting, and really the primary purpose is in order to learn more about regular assessments, special assessments, as well as the budgeting process in your communities here in Colorado. We will also touch on the auditing process, as well as discussing briefly the nature of reserves and having a reserve account or conducting a reserve study. Joining with me today is, well, first and foremost, my name is David Donnelly. I am the HOA Information Officer and the manager of the Education, Communications, and Policy Program. We usually refer to that as the ECP program. And with me today also is Amanda Lopez, the HOA Information Support Specialist.
Mm. Thank you, David.
Absolutely. So today, Amanda is going to be monitoring the chat for questions. If as we progress forward, if any questions arise, please feel free to shoot a message there in the chat. Not the Q&A, if you have access to that, if you see that on in your Zoom field, if you can stick to the chat, that'll make it so that we've got one location where we can follow all of your questions and we will do our very best to answer as many of those questions as possible. But of course, if we do not get to your question, please feel free to reach out to us at the email address that we included, and we'll go from there. All right. Before I get too much further, I do need to verify that we are in fact recording. I think that we are. Forgive me. I want to make sure about that. Yes, we are recording. So we're in good shape there. I had made an error in a recent one of our HOA forums where I had failed to include that, failed to hit record. So I always do apologize about that. So with many of you, I've probably mentioned that I could be prone to technical error. So I apologize, but we're all set. So let's get going. As always, this disclaimer is important. The information that is being provided during this presentation is for educational purposes only and is not meant to be, nor should it be construed as legal advice. Any legal questions should be directed to a qualified attorney that is licensed here in the state of Colorado. Many of you that have attended our presentations in the past have also seen this slide. I know that it's somewhat redundant in that I place it on every one of our forums. However, I feel that it's very important that the public understands what the HOA Information and Resource Center can and cannot do. Our primary purpose is to gather and analyze and provide an informational report on HOAs, their registrations, complaints, as well as to provide information to homeowners, and that includes board members and community association managers and attorneys alike, about what the rights and the responsibilities that are created under the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. For those of you that are new to this, the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act is often referred to as CCIOA or as Kiowa. Wanted to be clear about that because I've gotten a lot of questions about what is Kiowa? What does Kiowa mean? And it's merely an abbreviation for CCIOA, rather than spelling it all out and saying the full name of the statute. Many people do refer to that, but I do, of course, I received the question, what is Kiowa? I can't find Kiowa. They're looking to spell it as the Native American tribe's name or as the name of the city here in Colorado. Leads to some confusion. So wanted to be very clear about that. What we do not do here in the HOA Information and Resource Center, we are not a regulatory program. We do not mediate or arbitrate. we cannot provide legal advice, and we do not act as an advocate. What a significant benefit to my office is that we are able to independently provide information to callers or inquirers, and many times I've found it to be very effective, that if I receive a phone call or an email from one side of a, let's just say it's a dispute, that the other side can also reach out to me, and we can discuss their respective rights and responsibilities as well, helping the two sides of a dispute see a little bit closer to eye. Again, we are not a mediator. However, we can provide you with information that is directly relevant to what is going on in your communities, and that I find that to be a very big benefit. So moving on, this presentation is mostly directed towards homeowners and board members, as well as community association managers. Each of our different forums can have a little bit of a different focus, including occasionally first-time home buyers. What is it like to live in an HOA? What do I need to know before I buy in an HOA? That would be another type of party that a presentation could be directed towards. But this is a pretty broad topic that is relevant to all of you. So want you to be able to pay close attention. So let's get into it then, if we can. What does how do your communities pay for expenses? Where does it obtain those revenues? That's the fundamental question that we're going to be really addressing today. And pursuant to Kiowa, a common interest community is any real estate that is described by a declaration. Sometimes you'll hear those referred to as CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, with respect to which a person, by virtue of such person's ownership of a unit, is obligated to pay for real estate taxes, insurance premiums, maintenance, or improvement of other real estate described in the declaration. Some of your communities might have a pool. Some of your communities might have a privately maintained road. Some of you might simply have a monument sign at the entrance. Every community is different with respects to what it is responsible for versus what the homeowner is responsible for. But those expenses come from each respective homeowners paying as a part of their ownership in the community. So the primary, there really are two different types of assessments. Let's first touch on regular assessments. The purpose of regular assessments is the overall operational costs of the association. Different communities vary, but they can be paid monthly. They could be paid quarterly or annually. Since this varies by community, it doesn't matter, quite frankly, how they are. What matters for a homeowner is that you know how often you need to get into the system or to pull out your checkbook and write your checks. Different communities collect differently. There are lots of communities that collect merely once a year, and more often than not, that due date is coming up very quickly here towards the end of the year, or even January 1st. Keep that in mind so that you can ensure that you pay your assessments, your periodic regular assessments, on time to avoid late costs and penalties and fees. I really receive a lot of questions here in the office about what are Denise, the link will not be available for until the recording has been kind of proofed over and posted. So usually by Monday, that should be posted up, Denise. But one of the questions that we receive a lot is there such a thing as what the average dues are in Colorado? And the short answer is absolutely not, because different communities have different amenities, different communities have different needs, financial needs. Perhaps they're needing to ensure 100 acres of open space. Others need to maintain an elevator or whatever, what have you. There really is no average. You could Google it, I think, or your internet search engine of choice, and the number would probably be somewhere around $250. But that number is not a helpful number because it doesn't take into consideration the age of your community, the condition of your community, the history of your community, and what the amenities are in that community. So dues really need to reflect what the operational needs are of the community. In this day and age, no doubt all of you have heard about inflation. That means probably you need to be prepared as a unit owner for the prospect of an increased amount of for periodic dues in the upcoming year. Board members, you need to be prepared for that as well. You need to reach out to your vendors and ensure that pricing is rock solid, and for whether it's a little bit more than it was this past year or not, whatever, you need to know that so that you can adequately include that in your budget, which we'll get to shortly here. Um, uh, when we raise dues in Colorado, or again, regular assessments, this most often it can be done solely by the board, and the board can do that as much as it needs to. If premiums for insurance have quadrupled, it might not be, it might be more than a 5% raise in assessments. It could be much larger than that. Be prepared for that, and plan for that, of course, as well, board members, as much as possible, so that you can mitigate those costs for your homeowners, because many people, I mean, if you think about it, every single person lives on a fixed income. We only make as much as we make, and therefore even a moderate amount of increase in dues can be a significant burden on parties. So do your best to be cognizant of the varied needs of your community members. But an exception that's worth pointing out here is that some associations may have limitations in their governing documents or in an annual cap. This is a somewhat of a limited exception. There are certainly communities across Colorado that do have these caps included in their governing documents, you would probably see it as in your declaration as something that says something to the extent of an annual cap or limitation on assessment increases, something to that extent. Look for that, board members, so that you know that you're in compliance with your own governing documents if need be. In order to raise those dues in Colorado, it's usually, like I said, a vote of the board. It rarely requires that the unit owners need to vote on this. Now, with that being said, even in the event that a unit owner vote is not required, a board is required to obtain unit member input, and that's so. Have your board meeting, discuss this, listen openly to your community members about their thoughts, and then a board can take a vote. So, unit owner vote, no. Unit input, yes. And then, of course, most importantly, board members, any raising of assessments that is done, whether it's at a board meeting or at a unit owner meeting, should be reflected in the minutes of that meeting.
Hey, David, we have a few questions in here that I want to go over that maybe we can go over regarding the regular assessments. I know we're going into special. One question in here that we have is if you can comment on the recent change in the responsible governance policies limiting fine assessments to $500. This is for HOA with high value homes. This does not provide a distinctive to violation HOA regulations or covenants. Is there a move to address this new limitation?
Well, that's a good question, Holly. I'm not really in a position where I can speak to prospective legislation, although I do have an understanding from both members of the public as well as others that the bill that you're referring to, HB 221137, is being looked at to potentially be revised. Now, I can't speak to whether or not they're looking at that specific issue. Um, uh, Violations certainly are the fines, penalties, and fees that you can charge certainly do come as an incentive in order to follow the rules. I would certainly encourage you to reach out to your respective representatives, state representatives, and state senators to discuss that and say if you feel that there needs to be a increase or a decrease in that maximum penalty. Certainly share your thoughts with them so that when they're coming into the next legislative session, which will begin shortly here in the new year, that they are apprised of those thoughts and concerns, because I think you bring up a very valid point. What else? Anything else?
Yes, we do have one from Gigi. Should the regular assessments include non-cash expenses, such as amounts for the reserve items or capital costs?
If I understand your question correctly, Gigi, I think are you saying, well, our actual expenses are would amount to $510 a month, but we also have an intention to fund our reserve account, so we're going to say 520 is our dues. I believe that that's what the nature of your question is, and yes, it should. If your intention is to fund a reserve account, that should be built into, in my opinion. I think that it would be wise to fund it through that rather than needing to fund it through a special assessment, because when you're needing to traditionally, and we'll talk about this in a moment, special assessments are usually a little bit more on a short-term basis. We need a roof now. We need to address this broken system now. Our boiler, our heaters, whatever it might be, our elevator is broken, and guess what? We live in a 20-story building. That's an expense that you need to pay now. And so oftentimes special assessments are for cash needed in the short term in order to make a major repair. And as a result of that, if you need to do that, not every community member is going to have in their coffers that amount of money to pay into the reserves in order to pay for that repair or replacement on a short-term basis. So building your cash reserves is probably a prudent thing to do from a business perspective as you move forward. Yes.
Thank you. Do you want to answer one more on
Sure.
the regular? And then that's it that we have as far as the regular assessments go. Doug says, I'm on the board of our condominium HOA in Fort Collins. We have a very complex formula for allocating regular dues amongst owners that includes consideration of square footage and general versus limited common elements. Do you have guidance on how we might simplify the process of calculating dues while still being fair and equitable?
That's a good question, Doug, because it's a challenge. It's actually a challenge in the community that I used to reside in as well, where we had different types of units and different types of buildings that had very different designs and different amenities to them, such as water and heat and the like, were offered in some as a common element and as a personal property or personal responsibility in some of the other units. So it can be very challenging. It's important for you to know, though, that that to amend the allocation of how special assessments are determined, that is set forth in your declaration. So it would require an amendment to your declaration to do so. Many communities across the state of Colorado do either do things by square footage or and then also even for some of those limited elements that are provided by the community, such as, let's talk about heat. If you have the infrastructure to break that down and say, okay, well, we're using this much gas on our heater boiler in order to heat the homes, and then we use this much to make hot water. It can be absolutely very complicated. I think mapping that out and getting a good feel for everything that and how it's all determined in the first place would probably be an important first step in order to help determine if if an amendment would be appropriate, and also if an amendment could in fact pass through your community as well, because amendments to your declaration do require a rather substantial amount of community consent. The most common number we see is 67% in Colorado, although the number can be anywhere between 50% and 67% of the community to consent to that. So check your governing documents for what your number would specifically be. Let's, I'll answer this last one real quick, and then we'll jump back into special assessments. If there is such a thing as a capital call in Colorado, and although we don't really call it that, that's kind of what a special assessment is. It is a special assessment is the statement, Denise, of that we want money, need money, choose to elect to call on all of the owners to pay the association money for a particular purpose. That could be because we have a major repair. It could be because we want to build our reserves. Again, the community I referenced before, we did a special assessment in that community in order to build our reserves. Now, because it was our goal in that case was to build our reserves, we did not require everyone to pay that special assessment amount immediately or within 30 days or something to that extent. We allowed the community allowed them to pay it with as an increase over the next 12 months. Because of the nature of that, we were just trying to build our reserves to be more financially sound should an emergency arise, and we not need to call a special assessment and say that $1,000 is due upon receipt of this notice. Rather, so we agreed it was more efficacious to raise our dues and conduct this special assessment so that we had the money when we needed it, rather than shoot, we need the money now, we need to call a special assessment immediately and make that due and payable immediately. So so let's talk about the special assessment sum. I've already mentioned that it's usually for a special purpose, like a repair, replacement, building your reserves, perhaps new construction. And your community documents may have specific details on how these bills, these special assessments need to be paid. If not, if they are silent, then it is left to the board's discretion to determine whether it's due upon receipt, due in 30 days, or as I mentioned before, payable over 12 months, whatever the case might be. So if you're, as long as your governing documents do not have specific details on that, because Kiowa is silent, you have some considerations, board members, on how you can make those due and payable. Similar to regular assessments, special assessments are imposed in the same way, with a vote, usually of just the board, and board members need to be aware of if there are limitations in your governing documents that A, include an annual cap, or B, require community voting. Again, uncommon, but it does exist, that says maybe any special assessment over $500 requires community a community vote for approval. Whether a vote is required or not, though, it is important to remind you again, just like regular assessments, that the board is required to obtain unit member input. The board should clearly communicate what these savings, what this special assessment is for. Is it because we have a hole in the roof Is it because our boiler died on us? Is it because our intention is to save over time so that we don't need to have an emergency special assessment down the road when the emergency is on top of us rather than us at some point in the future. Gigi's asking if it's the board's responsibility to maintain an adequate reserve. A board has the responsibility of a fiduciary to their community. However, there is not an express requirement or a responsibility that they maintain adequate reserves. It is best practices to maintain an adequate reserve so that you can pay the varying fees that you may face in your community. But I mean, so would it be prudent? Yes. But is it expressly required? No, it is not at this point in Colorado. These reserve funds, many of you might be familiar with the terms of an operating account versus versus a reserve account or a savings account. Reserve funds generally are the latter. It's when we're talking about funds that are usually and probably should be maintained in a separate account. That could be a savings account, it could be an additional checking account or a brokerage account even, and those funds are dedicated to the unanticipated or deferred expenses within your community. Again, usually these are large expenses, such as we need to replace a $100,000 boiler, or a quarter-mile worth of fencing along the property because our plat map and declarations say that that is the responsibility of your community association to maintain, for instance. These can be very expensive projects, and so being prepared for them is prudent and very is going to pay off in spades for your owners and your board members moving forward. Usually these funds are available to be used at the discretion of the board, and again with the caveat that unless your governing documents require unit approval. In Colorado, the investment of reserve funds is not expressly regulated. I get a lot of questions about this. Which is what do I do? We have, because some communities have $1 million in reserve, and that's wonderful. A lot of communities clearly, of course, don't. But boards should definitely consider basic facts like interest rates. I mean, if you've got one bank that does a 0% interest rate and another, because interest rates are raising right now and have been increased of late, if you've got a substantial sum of money there, it can make a difference. FDIC insurance is also another consideration. The current federal laws say that the FDIC will insure up to $250,000 per depositor. So that means, and let's hope that this never happens, but that means that if I have $500,000 in a bank and that bank we run into an amazing financial crisis, I'm only insured up to the first $250,000. And this is per depositor. If you're a couple and you have a joint account, you probably have 2 depositors on that account. That would mean you would be insured up to the $500,000 limit. But we don't have that in commercial accounts like this. Because your depositor is the association. It is not an individual human being. So be cognizant of that. If you have excess reserves above and beyond $250,000, consider opening up another account at another financial institution. And furthermore, other things to consider is that you might have other investment opportunities, such as a brokerage account where you're investing in stock markets and the like, or in certificates of deposit, which you might have with your current financial institution. Basically, I guarantee that I will give you this amount of money for a 12-month or an 18-month period, and you will give me a higher interest rate because of that. So consider that as well. That's a common, certainly lower risk financial investment to consider as for boards. Again, I am not a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, but you can certainly reach out to an accountant, reach out to a financial advisor as a board member, consult with them, and see what their recommendations are based on the circumstances within your community. The Colorado Nonprofit Corporation Act discusses the type of authority that board members have, and provided the following: they essentially are granted discretion as long as they are acting in good faith, as long as they're acting with the care that an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances. I know that's some legalese, but if you read it a couple times, it basically says, what would a normal person do in this circumstance? As long as I'm acting pretty close to that, I probably I'm okay. And thirdly, that the board members or member or members is acting in the manner that the director and the officer reasonably believes to be in the best interests of the non-profit corporation. So I can certainly provide you examples. If I'm going to go and invest in cryptocurrency, that may not right now be something that would be construed by a reasonable person to be in the best interests of the nonprofit corporation, of the association. Again, I'm not a financial advisor, but something to keep in mind. It is important for, if there is a doubt, that you should seek the advice of a professional in order to adequately and appropriately invest any reserve funds. But for the most part here, most of the people on this call, we're talking about a savings account, an interest-bearing savings account where you can hold that money until you need to use that money. Before we move on, it's important that you guys all pay attention to the fact that that there may be some legislative updates in this sphere in this part of HOA life in the future. Earlier this year, a bill was introduced in the Colorado legislature that would have regulated reserve funds and the investment of reserve funds to a certain extent. The bill did not become law, but in vetoing this bill, there was some discretion and information kind of passed back to the Colorado General Assembly to say there are some good ideas in this bill. But this bill doesn't do it well enough. So keep in mind that might be changing at some point in the future. Again, I'm not a prognosticator. I'm not here to guess what the legislature will do with their authority as far as preparing and passing laws. But keep an eye on it, and of course check back with our office in the future, because anytime that a bill that affects HOAs is passed here in Colorado, we do provide legislative updates. So let's talk about reserve studies for a bit. There are different types of reserves studies, and there are different types of professionals and companies that conduct these reserve studies. It could be an accountant, it could be an engineer, but generally speaking, once these are completed, it can be a reserve study can be used in order to estimate the association's future reserve requirements. And what I mean with that is, we have a general idea. We know that roofs last X number of years. We know that a boiler lasts on average, a certain number of years. You look at anything within your own home. If you have a hot water heater, it has an estimated life. You might be able to squeeze a couple years extra out of it. Great. But if we know as a community that we are going to have a significant expense at some point in the near future, or even the distant future, 20 years from now, there is nothing that precludes the community from starting to save for that now. Again, that's prudent business advice to consider, and especially with aging communities. You have stairs, you have other equipment that does go bad, that needs repairs, maintenance, and even occasionally replacement. Keeping that in mind is an important thing as you move forward. Kiowa, the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, does not expressly require a reserve study, but your governing documents may. Um, and so check that. It could be under certain circumstances. It could be on a periodic basis. The specific language within your communities is important for board members to know. Beyond that, I just said a moment ago, Kiowa does not require a reserve study. What Kiowa does require, though, is that every community have a reserve study policy. And what that says is that it needs to, and I'm not going to read this entire subsection of section 209.5 here, but it sets forth when it says all communities have to create a policy that makes it so that we have certain circumstances when a reserve study may be necessary, and if those criteria are met, a reserve study should be completed. Maybe it's your reserves get lower than a certain amount, or it could be, like I said, a periodic basis. This information is something that basically it's a current board telling a future board, you have to do this under these circumstances so that you're adequately protecting the financial interests of the community moving forward. That policy is defined and approved and formally adopted by your boards. It should be specifically tailored to your community. It shouldn't be a copy and paste from some other community somewhere else in Colorado or in the country. And it should take into consideration the specific details of your community, like your amenities, like the age of your common elements. Keeping that in mind. So, how are we on questions there, Amanda?
Yeah, I was going to say, we want to answer a few questions. We have a few. If we want to go over these ones, these are in regards to the reserve study. Okay, so what percentage of operating budget should go to reserves annually? Is what Bob wants to know.
There isn't a specific rule to that, and so it really does depend on what your community feels is necessary and appropriate as it moves forward. And again, I wish that I could say give you a specific number, Bob, but it varies so very much based on the age of your community and the nature of the amenities that you have. I talk to many people on a daily basis that their only expense is road maintenance because they have a rural community. They don't have a pool, they don't have a clubhouse, they don't have even a monument sign. They just maintain a private road. And so but even when you have limited numbers of common elements such as that, something that's pretty straightforward, it can vary because vendors come and go, costs rise and fall, and so it's hard to there isn't a rule on best practices there. That's what a reserve study can help those say. Listen, you've been deferring maintenance on this amenity, on this common element for X number of years. You know that it's going to need attention sometime soon. So that's so you taking into consideration those specifics. Even the best maintained communities still have emergencies come along, whether that's a hailstorm or whatever that might happen. And so having that nest egg, so to speak, is a good practice, but it's difficult to be certain about what is going to be required going forward.
Thank you so much for answering that one. We do have one from Cindy. The question basically is just wanting to know if there is a law that prohibits the unequal distribution of capital debt when all properties are affected.
So, when we're talking about special assessments, your governing documents may provide that if a special assessment only affects a certain type of units within your community, that could be assessed specifically to them. However, that isn't very common, and so it's traditionally special assessments will be assessed in the same manner that your regular assessments are. Perhaps that's by a one-for-one basis. It could be based on square footage of your community. So there isn't necessarily an express way to divide that out. Very commonly, a special assessment affects the entire community, and therefore is charged or assessed across the entire community in that way.
Thank you, David, for answering that one. Let's go ahead and move on to budgets, right?
Yep.
Good.
So at the onset here, I'd like to explain that this discussion is very limited when it comes to communities that were created before July 1st of 1992, because Kiowa does not expressly define a process to approve a budget for those communities, unless, of course, there's always an exception, unless this exception has been met, which is that the community that was created before Kiowa has expressly adopted Kiowa in its entirety, or certain sections of Kiowa, such as the adoption, the approval adoption process. But for communities created after July 1st of 1992, the process is as follows. Kiowa did its best to create a straightforward three-step process that at least that's how I identify it. I've broken it down in that way. The board drafts and adopts a budget. 2, the board provides notice of the adopted budget to the unit owners. And 3, a meeting is held for the unit owners to review and consider a veto. That is if one word should be highlighted here, it is the word veto. And we will talk more about that in just a few slides, but Kiowa specifically states that an association shall adopt and amend budgets for review of revenues, expenditures, and reserves, and collect assessments for common expenses of the unit owners. Because board members have a fiduciary duty, they should be reviewing and updating contracts with their vendors when budgets come around, and conduct due diligence as well. That means reaching out, perhaps certainly with larger contracts, you should look for competition. You should look to obtain multiple quotes for contracts. This is subject to your discretion. I appreciate that and understand that, but a good practice is to look to shop this around. I've talked to so many people that have had the same vendor for 20 years, and they've never shopped this around. They have no idea what competition might be. It could be the best price on the market still. I don't know that, but most importantly, you don't know that until you shop it around. So review some of these things, particularly with these bigger items. I mentioned road maintenance is a big one. Insurance is a big one. And those are easy things to shop around. You might have to fill out an application with a couple different insurance brokers, but you're going to get multiple quotes from an insurance broker in that way, and you'll be able to have that information, have that data, and bring it back to your community most of all, because there are members of the community that don't know the full processes that are undertaken by boards when they're proposing and drafting and adopting budgets. Show them your work. Show them that you've already done this homework. and that we are selecting the best quality work for the best price. Those two things are not always the same, but and that's where discretion of your board can come into play here. I could hire a terrible vendor what good is it if they're the cheapest if they're a terrible vendor? Use your discretion and consider these things so that and show your work so that your homeowners know what you're doing. The more you can increase that transparency, the better off you will be. Budgets, generally speaking, should set forth the revenue and the expenditures of the community, and they should be broken down by specific line items. And here are just a couple examples. Revenue, assessments. You could have a line item for revenue special assessments. You could most of you probably don't have any rental income coming into your community, but you might have other incomes like some membership dues to us or rental or usage fees, something to that extent for your clubhouse, for graduations or a wedding or a birthday, whatever the case might be. Yeah, break those down so that your community can see where the money comes from and also where it goes. Your expenses are repairs and maintenance or utilities, such as lighting for your common areas or electric. And then contracted services, and do what you can in order to break that down so that you say, these are my legal our estimated budgeted legal fees. This is what we think landscaping fees are going to be. This is what we think our community association management companies fees are going to be. A lot of these things are determined by contract, and therefore when I'm saying we think that that's what they're going to be, great. But we know that there are also other expenditures. We know that generally speaking that most communities budget at least some money to put towards unknown collection costs, because if we have a homeowner that's not paying, A, that's lower assessments that we're going to collect, but B, that's an expense that we have to pay as a community to collect. That's not usually part of a contract. Lawyers don't traditionally say we're going to do that for a flat fee, because they don't know how much work it's going to be. They could be collecting against one person this year. They could be collecting against 25 people. Use your knowledge of your community's board members to determine what those expenses should be as you move forward. Step 2, providing notice of the adopted budget to the unit owners. Kiowa specifically sets forth that within 90 days of the adoption of the proposed budget. Now, this is important because, and I received a question about it just 24 hours ago. The board must either mail or otherwise deliver. And that means maybe posting on the website. It means maybe emailing. It means maybe some other form of communication, but it does not necessarily require a posting by mail. It has to be an approved form of communication. We can't say I'm only sending it by email if I don't have everyone's emails. The board is required to convey this information to every homeowner. If you want to save some money, maybe email's okay. If you don't have a website, though, you can't post it on your website. So you got to find a way to get it to every homeowner in one form or another. And you're sending a summary of that budget to all the owners and providing them a notice of the date when the meeting for the owners is going to be held to consider that budget. Many communities do this, and I think that it's a good practice, is give a side-by-side comparison to the current budget. Show them what we spent in 2022 and what we are proposing or budgeting for 2023. That way we can see, hey, we're expecting that our legal fees are going to be 120% of what they were last year. Why? And that way people can ask the questions. Why the change? Why is it increasing? Oh, well, because we have more people that we're going to need to send to collections this year, for instance, or because our landscaping company came back and said they want to charge twice as much. So we shopped this around. We got 3 new budgets, three proposals to cut our grass and trim our hedges, et cetera, on a periodic basis, and it's going to cost us this much this year. Let them see that, let them understand that, and also here's a great place to show how much you are choosing to put into reserves. It could probably, maybe it's a monthly transfer. We're going to put we're going to put $1,000 each month into from our operating into reserves. That should be reflected on this budget. That way, everyone will know. This meeting needs to take place within a reasonable period of time after the mailing or the delivery. I can't tell you what a reasonable period of time is, but if it's it shouldn't be 2 days later, and it shouldn't be 100 days later. It should be a reasonable period of time, enough time for people to make arrangements so that you can see what you need to see in this and consider it, come up with questions, and attend the meeting. Just as a side note, a lot of communities use their regularly scheduled meeting for the of the unit owners, and that's what we oftentimes refer to as the annual meeting, to present the annual budget. Because why? The best reason for that is because that is when the most number of community members will usually show up for your annual meeting, if you have such an annual meeting. If some communities have multiple owners meetings throughout the year, that's wonderful news. Kiowa only requires that there be at least one unit owner meeting per year, and that's why we kind of refer to that as the annual meeting. If you're using it with that, then if you're going to do this budget approval at the same time as your annual meeting, the notice needs to comply with the Kiowa regulations in subsection 308, which says not less than 10 days, not less than 10 days, and not more than 50 days from the date of mailing is when the meeting has to take place. So keep that in mind, that you have to follow those restrictions. I mentioned that we were going to come back to the word veto. At this meeting, the members will hold a meeting to review and to consider a veto. That unless your community documents expressly state that it is a ratification or approval process, it is going to be a veto. That so if it's a terrible budget, if the community members are unhappy, they have the right to say no, not so fast. They don't have to say we like this. They just have to say we don't like this. But how much it takes is set forth in the rules, and the veto process is very important. It's important that you understand that a quorum if you're only holding a budget meeting, a quorum is not required to be present at that meeting. Is it a good practice to try to get approval of your budget at a meeting like that? Probably not, in my personal opinion. But if you call your annual meeting, you don't get enough people at the meeting, you could theoretically still hold the budget portion of that meeting, even if you don't have a quorum. It doesn't solve your problem that Section 308 of Kiowa still requires that you have a unit owner meeting at least once a year. You must reschedule your annual meeting, so to speak, in order to be in compliance with Kiowa. But you could knock out the budget there. But why? Why would you do that? That doesn't make a lot of sense. If you know that you're going to reschedule because you have to get a quorum for another meeting, you can. And maybe it's best practice to defer that so that you have the budgetary proceedings at the annual meeting when you do in fact have a quorum. The more input, the better off your community will be. So let me hit one more slide here, Amanda, and then maybe we can do a couple questions. With respects to a budget amendment, your communities are allowed to amend your budgets. Maybe that's because you were notified in June of the year that you need to conduct a special assessment in order to pay for a major repair. So you adopt, you have a current budget. You need to amend it now in order to get an updated budget. The process is virtually the same. The board adopts, drafts and adopts the amended budget. They provide notice of the amended budget to the unit owners, and then they hold a meeting to consider a veto of it. So know that that is a right that you have out there, and that you should, that's something that you should consider. Maybe before we go to some of our kind of our closing tips here, let's see if there are any questions, Amanda.
Yeah. Well, I did answer one. I know Robert was wanting to know if we had, if this will be replayed, but I did let him know it's going to be on our website, of course, because it's being recorded. David wants to know if this is only for HOAs post Kiowa. If all this falls
Primarily, yes, it is, unless your pre-Kiowa community has expressly adopted portions of Kiowa or Kiowa in its entirety. Yes, for communities that are pre-Kiowa, that were created before 1992 and that have not adopted Kiowa expressly through an amendment, their budgetary processes would be set forth in your governing documents. And if silent, because that's usually commonly a follow-up, says, well, I looked through my documents and it doesn't say how we should do this. If that's the case, a board can consider adopting a policy such as what Kiowa does. You don't have to, in that case, expressly say it's because Kiowa says it, but you could use that as a model, as a format by which you could create that process. A process is required by statute to be included in your bylaws. So keeping that in mind, not every bylaw follows the letter of the law to the T. I know that I think a lot of us are familiar with that fact, but if you're aware that that your bylaws are inadequate because they don't include this, for instance, you should take the steps in order to adopt that, so that you know how to do it, that future board members know how to do it, and that every one of your unit owners understands how it's done. That would be a good practice.
Great. Amazing. Gosh, you're so knowledgeable, David. What will we do without you? Okay. What can be done if we cannot get a quorum for annual meetings? Crystal wants to know this.
A couple things. Door knocking and door knocking are the first three. After that, explore proxies. Proxies are an excellent way to obtain a quorum, because you don't necessarily need warm bodies to be at the meeting. You need to have representation of the owners to meet that quorum, whatever your quorum may be. Traditionally, it's usually around 20% in Colorado. And if you check your governing documents for that specific number. If your governing documents don't say anything, Colorado law says that it's 20%, unless your community is greater than 1,000 units, and then it's 10%. For more information, check out our last HOA forum, which was about voting procedures and proxies for that. But try knock on some doors, try to get some proxies. Because if you walk in the door as yourself, you've got your one vote. If you walk in the door with 5 other proxies, guess what? You're 6 votes, and you're that much closer to a quorum. And there are a myriad of reasons why people don't attend their annual meetings. It could be apathy, but it also could be I'm busy, I have to work during that time, I don't have childcare. Whatever the situation may be, it doesn't matter if a lot of people really do care about what's going on in their community. So if you come up to them, you canvass the neighborhood, and whether it's you're walking your dog and you talk to people at the bus stop, or you're in the elevator, or you go door to door and knock on doors, say, hey, did you get the notice for the annual meeting? Are you going to be able to attend? Oh, you're not. Would you be willing to execute a proxy so that we can make sure that we can actually conduct business at that annual meeting? That's great. And most people are going to say sure to that. In my experience, a lot of people are going to say yes to that because they do care about it. They know that these things have to happen in their communities, and they'd like to know what's going on. So that I think that's the best option on how to address meeting quorum at your meetings.
Okay, perfectly answered, of course. Do you want to answer more? We do have quite a few more questions that came in regards to the budget and whatnot. So, do we want to go over these questions or?
Let me do a couple. Because
Okay.
I think as I'm looking at some of them are pretty quick. I think so. How to extend a budget as we are changing our fiscal year from January 1st to March 1st. You could do a budget amendment to cover that. One thing I don't really recall addressing too much was what happens when a veto happens. If a veto does happen, the existing budget continues to move forward until such time as a new budget is in fact approved or not vetoed, more accurately. So your current budget could continue on, but at the same time, there is nothing that would preclude your community from conducting an amendment to your, or creating an amendment to your budget so that you just have a holdover until you get to where your new fiscal year is scheduled to start. If the bottom line doesn't change, can the board make line item adjustments? I think that what that's asking is, can I move $5,000 from attorney's fees to landscaping? Or for something to that extent, it would probably be a better practice to communicate that to the community so that they understand our legal fees are going to change, and you can say that you absolutely could share with your community what the methodology was that our bottom line is not changing, but because we've reallocated funds from line item A to line item C, for instance. If a board does not get around to creating a budget until April, can they raise the dues retroactively back to January 1st? It would be pretty challenging to justify it that way. Michelle, you might instead consider if there's a need to conduct a special assessment in order to do that. I'm not aware of specific authority that would allow you to retroactively increase dues in that way. And it would also create an accounting nightmare, quite frankly, because what if in between January 1st and April 1st, 12 people moved in and out of your community? How are you going to collect those dues from someone that didn't live there on January 1st, but maybe closed on March 31st? That would be a financial nightmare, and ripe for a lot of dispute and difficulties for your community. Is there a limit to the rollover amount a board can carry forward in a year? Not necessarily, Leonard. A board has discretion on what it can really do with any excess. It certainly is permitted by statute to refund funds to a community. However, that doesn't happen very often, and it would probably take significant pressure from the community, but rather would make a lot more sense to put those into reserves so that you have additional cushion and reserve funds in the future. Replay. Okay. How to find your website, at what tabs. If you, Robert, if you go to the very top, the first comment that I put in there, there is a specific link. There are 3 links there. One of the links is to our website, the one you just cited. One is to an email address. The third is to the specific website where you will locate the slides and the recording once posted. Let's jump to our pro tips here because we are actually a few minutes over already because of your excellent questions. But these are just kind of some takeaways that I want board members, CAMs, and unit members to take into consideration. Okay. Um, uh, um, uh, Start early with the budgeting process. Get relevant information about the goals for your community, and get them to your CAM, get your community association manager, get them to your budget committee if you have a budget committee, so that they can be included. What I mean when I'm talking about goals is we want to overhaul the open space. We want to put in new fences this year. I know we've been deferring this for years. This is our on our to-do list for this year. Communicate those so that and start getting quotes on it. Um, uh, um, uh, Most vendors lock in their quote prices. If you lock that in now for a project that you might be doing in the summer, that might be a whole lot more financially lucrative than if you get a quote from them in June, when they're high demand and other things can happen between now and then too. Board members should don't rely on your late fees and penalties and interests to fund your community. This is an important one, I think. Don't I mean, yes, we get it. You're going to have some late fees. You're going to have some interest that you're going to collect, and other penalties and other violations and things like that. Don't expect that that's how you're going to fund your legal fees. That's how you're going to fund your landscaping. That keep that in mind. Keep assessments are all of your primary source of revenues. You rely on that. Don't rely on speculative things, because you don't know how much you're going to collect. It's at best it's a guess that what you're going to collect. Board members, I always say this: just be transparent with your community. Communicate as often and as early as you can with your unit owners, so that they understand what the goals of your community are. And somewhat related, um, you board members, I really want to encourage you to, especially with your larger communities, take into consideration not just what you think is important or what you see, but the entire community. I've heard lots of concerns saying, guess what? It is lush and beautiful and green right by the president's house, but my grass is all dead because they don't want to fix the landscaping, the irrigation in my area. You need to uniformly spread the maintenance and attention throughout your community. So it's not just what you see as important. Get input from your community so that you understand what is important, what is being neglected, and what might need that attention. Um, uh, Board members, this could be an action on that you take on, or that you direct your management or budget committees to do as well. But conduct due diligence, particularly on those larger projects. I've said this before and I'll say it again. There is no rule that you have to take a project and go get multiple quotes. 3 quotes is always what everybody says, but there's no requirement for that. But you ask the question, are you conducting your due diligence, which is a duty that you have as a board, if you're not exploring these things? Are you fulfilling your fiduciary duties to your community if you simply get 1 quote for $120,000 worth of fencing and then you call it a day? Probably not. That's a big expense, and you need to take that into consideration. And you will be probably rather amazed at the variations in the costs from different vendors. Board members and CAMs together, I want to encourage you to look at your contracts with each other and negotiate new terms. If the board says, CAM, I really want to see you doing this, and or the CAM says, hey, we've run into lots of problems and we need to increase the costs for this type of work, reevaluate that. And to the extent that possible, try to tie in that kind of contract with your budget, so that you're not having a budget renegotiate, or excuse me, a contract renegotiation in the middle of your budget. That would be beneficial for you, for both the parties. I want to encourage communication between these two parties, especially boards and CAMs, so that expectations are clear, so that the understanding is there, and that everybody knows what the other is doing, and what they aren't doing as well. That's important, because there isn't a standard for what community association management companies do. If you look back at some of our previous forums, there isn't a standard of what a CAM contract is or isn't. So think about that. And then finally, unit members, I want to encourage you to try to understand the terms of these things too. You have a right as a unit owner to review contracts, whether that's your CAMS contract or your landscaping contract or whatever. Look at those and say, does it make sense? I mean, or maybe it's more this. Oh, now it finally does make sense. I thought they were supposed to come out anytime we got even a little bit of snow, but now I'm looking at the contract with the snow removal company, and it says they don't come out until we've got 4 or more inches. That might make so much more sense for you to conduct your diligence, so that you understand what you're supposed to be doing. On the flip side, that also helps you assist your board members keeping your vendors to account. If your snow removal companies got a contract with you that says they don't come out till 6 inches fall, but they're out there every time it snows 1 inch, and they're charging you for that, that's maybe fraud. That's maybe abuse. That's definitely not in accordance with the contract. And maybe your board members don't necessarily know that, and you're paying for that. Your board members are paying for that. You should be aware of that, and bring that to the attention of your board members and your CAM alike. So here we always have a kind of one of our closing slides, which is how to best contact us. We have lots of resources on our website, and I would encourage you to visit it. And you, of course, may send your inquiries to Dora, DORA, at Dora_DRE_HOA inquiries at state.co.us. I know that I think we're actually up to speed on those, other than Robert asking to repost those links, and you got that, Amanda. So I want to wish everyone a very happy holiday week coming up here. We will hold another forum in the month of December. That date is not yet scheduled, but it'll probably be right around the middle of the month, as our history is provided here, and we will certainly look forward to you attending that. In the interim, I wish you a very happy holidays, and thank you very much again for attending. I hope you have a great day.